CCP feels threatened by India, that India somehow undermines its legitimacy. What is the threat?
Well, uh, India is everything the CCP says isn't possible. It's a country of over 1 billion people that is run democratically. I mean, it's got ups and downs, but it's definitely democratic. And it has a growing economy. In fact, its economy is arguably doing better than the Chinese economy. It's a pluralistic society. It doesn't throw 1 million of its own ethnic and religious minorities in jail for the sake of domestic stability. It partners in relatively equitable ways with its neighbors. It has a relatively free press. All those things that Chinese Communist Party says is impossible if you want to govern such a large country and have economic growth. Right next door, you've got this living, breathing, thriving example of why that is completely wrong. And so it strikes right at the heart of the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. And it actually does go back to this issue. I mean, love in its many forms is the things that underpin an individual Indian's identity will be in many cases family, and of course we know that the Chinese Communist Party tried to destroy the family through the one-child policy, and faith. And of course, the Chinese Communist Party is threatened by adherence to anything except the dictates of the Chinese Communist Party, and freedom, which of course is also anathema to the Chinese Communist Party. So you've got this. India is obviously not perfect. Nothing involving humans is, but you have this much more human enabling society that's doing okay, right next door to this repressive, autocratic, dictatorial, very brittle, unhealthy society and governance system. So it doesn't make China look very good. It is very much humanity, love in the form of that kind of humanity versus a machine autocratic system, and you can see which one works better.
Well, I'm confused about something you said, Cleo. You said that China justifies its authoritarianism by saying, like, this is what's necessary to govern this many people to have economic growth. But I was told that if we give money to China and help their economy grow, that will make them less authoritarian.
Right. Yes. That was what people who, in some cases, were making money off of China were very convinced about, because it was working for a very small group of Americans, but it was certainly not working for the majority of Americans and others in the West. And it demonstrably didn't contribute to any form of loosening up in China. And actually, it was an Indian who explained this to me probably about 10, 15 years ago, by saying that the Chinese economic model is built on market manipulation and repression. There is no way that it can continue to grow economically if it democratizes, because then you would get workers who wanted to be paid properly, and people who didn't want huge environmental damage in their villages, and all of the sort of things that add cost to production if you're doing it in a normal way like you would in the rest of the world. So in order to be able to continue to have those economic advantages in the international marketplace, it had to continue with that repressive system and manipulative system, which included intellectual property theft and all those other sorts of things. So it was never really an option. It was never going to grow, become democratic, and continue its economic growth. because its economic growth was dependent on so many on the zeroing out of or considering externalities, economic externalities, things that everybody else in the world has to incorporate into their economic costs. Or any normal country does. It kind of got around it a little bit when it was allowed to join the WTO and fake normalize its economy. But the democratization process didn't wasn't congruent with with the kind of economic growth path. So the internal logic of it didn't make sense, and that was sort of when I started to realize that, and a few other things, how far advanced Indian analysis was on understanding how China operates, because they basically had similar histories, in terms of colonization, things like that, and had chosen a different path, so they could recognize it much more easily, and why they weren't doing that, and how come they couldn't compete with China in certain areas, that sort of a thing. And of course, India wasn't originally a neighbor with China. There was this buffer state of Tibet, and they watched China eat Tibet and become a neighbor of India from 1950 on. And so there was no mythologizing, sort of this thing about China not being expansionist. The Indians certainly knew that wasn't the case either. So a lot of these fallacies that we allowed to permeate Western discussions about China didn't really take hold within India, and it allowed them to see much more clearly what was going on within China and the operations of the Chinese Communist Party at home and abroad very early on.
So is this why these American investors were not raising the flag of investing in India? Because they knew that with India being a democracy, they couldn't make the kind of profit that they could make in China as long as they allow for horrible human rights atrocities.
Well, India also, and Indians will tell you, was a real mess for a very long time, in part economically, in part through kind of failed left-wing Western academic economic models being tested out in India. So, it was a real mess. And at the same time, there was an enormous amount of corruption. So I was going back through some of the early coverage that I did about India, again, like 15, 20 years ago. And the depth of the scandals, like the Commonwealth Games scandals or the 2G spectrum scandals, gives you an idea of how long ago this was, was costing the Indian economy billions of dollars. So it took, there was also a degree of dysfunction that the court cases in India could last generations, literally. There were a lot of other factors that made India a difficult place to invest. Land ownership issues. Each state was a little bit different. And that's slowly been cleared up, not completely, but certainly much better than it was before. So India had its own challenges, some of them as a result of Nehruvian economics, which didn't work. But it inherited, when India became independent in 1947, it was not one country. There was sort of the remnants of British India, and then there were over 500 princely states with varying degrees of autonomy. And there was Pakistan, which at that time consisted of West Pakistan, which is what is now Pakistan, and East Pakistan, which is what is now Bangladesh, not connected. They were kind of on either sides of India. And there was this partition where you had millions of people moving from, mostly Muslims, moving from India in a panic on trains to Pakistan, and the same with Hindus moving in the other direction. And then within 3 years, you had the Korean War and of course, what happened with Tibet, and then later on you had Bangladesh in the 70s, late 60s, early 70s, going through an independence movement, becoming independent, and then you had it's just been churning and churning from its inception. And in 1962, China invaded, or hit the border and pushed in through the border. So there's been a lot. It hasn't been an easy, slow process for the Indian state to coalesce, find its footing, and create a society and economy that is truly its own. It's been shedding a lot of these structures it still has laws on the books that are basically British colonial laws that give the administration a lot of power. If an Indian government official, especially say 10, 15 years ago, wanted to get you for whatever reason, there were volumes of laws that they could use to get you. And then you'd have to pay a bribe, or you'd end up tied up in court forever. And a lot of them were leftover British colonial laws. That's slowly being cleared away. And as that happens, and certain states are moving quicker than others, it becomes a much better place to do business. Obviously, much better place to live and just be a human being, as mentioned at the beginning. But in terms of competition for supply chain redirection, it makes a lot more sense now than it would before. So right at the time when we're seeing the weaknesses in the Chinese Communist Party system, this fragility, the collapse of the real estate market, the debt issues, you're starting to see the innate strengths of the Indians themselves, who are regaining control over their own systems, creating this competitive economy that is much more viable.